A racist police officer tried to handcuff a black woman inside a courtroom. Not because she did anything wrong. Not because she posed any threat. But simply because, in his eyes, she couldn't possibly be who she claimed to be, a federal agent. In that moment, in front of a silent crowd and a stunned judge, she extended her hand to show her badge, but he swatted it away like it was meaningless. "You're not FBI," he said with a sneer that stung deeper than the handcuffs. "That badge is fake, and you better come quietly before you make it worse for yourself." The courtroom turned ice cold. His voice echoed off the marble walls with a sharpness that cut through her like glass. No one moved. No one spoke. Everyone watched. Everyone heard. And no one, not even the judge, stepped in as this officer, filled with bias and blind pride, grabbed her wrist and twisted it behind her back. He forced her against the wooden rail, her cheek pressed to the polished surface where justice was supposed to live. But that day, justice had left the building. Her mouth was dry. Her heart pounded not just with fear, but with rage. She wasn't just a federal agent, she was the lead investigator of a case that was supposed to be revealed that same morning, right there, in that courtroom. She had walked in with evidence, with strategy, with purpose. And now she was on her knees, being treated like a criminal, because to him, a black woman in a sharp suit must have been pretending. He didn't see her credentials. He didn't hear her words. All he saw was her skin. "Where did you get this badge, huh?" he barked, holding it up like it was a joke. "Stole it off someone's desk." Laughter. From one or two deputies nearby. Not the crowd. Not the people watching. They knew something was wrong. They felt it. A heavy tension sat in the air like a storm that hadn't broken yet. People stared. Some pulled out phones, unsure if they should record. But no one dared intervene. She didn't fight back. Not physically. But her silence was deafening. Her eyes locked on his. Cold. Piercing. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," she whispered. And he laughed again, tightening the cuffs as if to silence her completely. What no one knew was that she had spent months, working undercover on a case that went deeper than anyone imagined. A case that involved not just low-level street crime, but corruption at the heart of law enforcement. She wasn't just there to testify, she was there to expose a ring of officers abusing their power, falsifying reports, targeting minorities. And the man who had her in cuffs. He wasn't just any officer. He was one of the names in her file. A name she had highlighted in red. A name that had a pattern of misconduct swept under the rug for years. A name she was ready to expose, with irrefutable proof. But he didn't know that. Not yet. In his mind, she was just another face in the crowd. Another black woman trying to make a scene. Another nobody walking into a place she didn't belong. He thought he was teaching her a lesson, that this was his domain, and people like her didn't belong in his world. That his word meant more than her truth. That his badge carried more weight than hers. He didn't know that she outranked him. He didn't know that she had been given the authority to arrest him, and several others. He didn't know that the people she came to protect were watching this unfold in horror. He didn't know that the flash drive in her bag, now tossed across the courtroom floor, held audio recordings that would change everything. The judge finally found his voice, asking, "Officer, what are you doing?" "She's on today's witness list." But even then, the officer stood his ground. "That's a mistake. There's no way this woman is with the Bureau. I know who's real and who's not." That moment, right there, that was the breaking point. The murmurs grew louder. People shifted in their seats. Reporters adjusted their cameras. Lawyers exchanged looks. A clerk quietly exited the room. The atmosphere cracked like thunder waiting to strike. Because what happened next would flip the entire courtroom on its head. What no one saw coming was that the woman in cuffs had the upper hand the entire time. That she had anticipated pushback. That this wasn't the first time her identity had been challenged, but it would be the last. That every humiliation she'd endured had led to this moment, where the truth would hit harder than any punch, any insult, any handcuff. She had warned him. But some people don't listen until the ground beneath them collapses. And when it did, when the truth finally came out, when she took back her power in front of everyone, he would be the one on his knees. But how? What did she do? And how did one of the most humiliating moments of her life become the most unforgettable comeback this courtroom had ever seen? Stay with us. Because you are not ready for what happens next. At Plow of Twist, we want to make something very clear: we do not tolerate racism in any form. This story is a work of fiction, but it reflects a harsh truth faced by many in real life. To every black viewer watching this right now, we see you, we hear you, and we stand with you. Your presence matters. Your strength inspires. Now sit back, because what you're about to witness is a story of justice, power, and a comeback you won't forget. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and let's dive into this powerful twist. Her name was Aaliyah Monroe. 37 years old, born and raised in the west side of Birmingham, Alabama, where kids grow up fast and quiet strength is learned in kitchens and on sidewalks, not in classrooms. Her mother worked double shifts at a hospital and her father, gone before she hit 12, left behind silence and 2 photos that sat dusty on a living room shelf no one ever touched. Aaliyah grew up with rules: don't talk too much, stay alert, and always keep your ID visible. By the time she was 15, she had memorized every look that came from behind suspicious eyes and learned to walk into rooms like she owned them, even when she wasn't welcome. That resilience was her inheritance. And it built the foundation for the woman who would later rise through the ranks of the FBI, not because she was chosen, but because she refused to be overlooked. She never spoke much about how she got into the bureau. Most people assumed she had connections, maybe a mentor. But the truth was more complicated. Her record was spotless, her education hard-earned, and her entry into federal law enforcement came with more closed doors than open ones. Even in training, she was underestimated. Not just because she was black. Not just because she was a woman. But because she was both, and in places like Quantico, that combination felt like walking a tightrope every single day. Still, she never stumbled. Her precision was unmatched. Her instincts were razor-sharp. And by 34, she was heading investigations most agents twice her age wouldn't dare touch. 3 years into her new position, she was transferred to St. Louis, Missouri. Not exactly the city people dream of, but a place with problems that matched her expertise. Rising cases of internal corruption within the police force. Systematic silencing of abuse claims. Anonymous whistleblowers whose voices echoed in empty hallways. That's where she came in. Aaliyah's specialty wasn't just cracking cases, it was reading people, peeling back facades, and uncovering the dirt hidden under polished shoes and clean press releases. She didn't need a badge to prove who she was. Her presence was proof enough. The courtroom she entered that day was housed inside the St. Louis Civil Justice Center, a building as gray and sterile as the politics that lived within its walls. Courtroom 4B. Thursday morning. She arrived in a tailored black suit, the kind that whispered authority without needing to shout. Her hair tied back in a clean bun. No jewelry, no flash, just clarity. A brown leather briefcase in her hand. The USB drive inside that case could ignite a firestorm. Testimonies. Phone logs. Bodycam footage that mysteriously disappeared, but had been recovered by her team. That morning, she wasn't coming to watch. She was the final witness. Her role was to testify on the findings of a months-long investigation targeting a network of officers accused of abusing their positions to frame black youth in low-income neighborhoods. Her testimony would name names. And some of those names were still on active duty. One of them, in fact, was Officer Brent Halverson. Halverson had been with the department for nearly 20 years. White. Middle-aged. A reputation that split the room. Half saw him as a no-nonsense enforcer, the other half saw him as exactly what he was, a man who built his authority on intimidation and bias. He was known for his temper, for his smirks when defendants cried, for stopping black drivers 3 times more often than white ones without ever being questioned. He called it instinct. The community called it something else. But no one ever challenged him directly. He had the respect of some high-ranking officials, the silence of others, and the fear of most. Until today. He stood by the security checkpoint just outside the courtroom, leaning on the side of a metal detector like it was his throne. His badge sat heavy on his chest. A swagger in his stance that dared anyone to question his authority. He saw her approach. Calm. Confident. Not hurrying. Not apologizing. And something in him flinched. The way she walked. The way she met his eyes without flinching. It didn't sit right with him. Not because she did anything wrong, but because she didn't shrink. She reached for her ID as she approached the courtroom doors. She was about to step inside, where a bailiff was already calling names. That's when it happened. Halverson moved from the wall in 2 strides. No greeting. No protocol. Just suspicion wrapped in authority. You can't go in there, he said flatly, holding out his arm to block her. She raised her ID. A black wallet with the bureau seal engraved on the front. Her fingers didn't tremble. Her eyes didn't dart. She opened it with precision. I'm with the bureau. I'm testifying today, she said, voice even, polite but firm. He didn't even glance down. His eyes stayed locked on her face. A pause. Then a short laugh. Yeah, right, he muttered. You must have picked that up at a pawn shop or something. Back off. She blinked, confused for a second. Maybe he didn't hear her right. Excuse me, she asked, calmly, lifting the badge a little higher. He stepped forward. Too close. I said back off. I don't care where you think you work, you're not getting in that courtroom with fake credentials. His tone had shifted. Louder. More aggressive. People turned to look. I'm on the list, she said. You can verify with the clerk. He reached for her wrist. No need, he barked. I can smell liars from a mile away. Let's not make a scene. But the scene had already begun. In one smooth movement, he yanked her wrist down and twisted it behind her back. The ID wallet dropped to the floor. Her briefcase tumbled open, papers spilling like confetti across the courthouse floor. And in that moment, every eye in the room turned toward them. The woman in the suit with her arm behind her back. The officer standing tall with a grin that said, I control this space. Her breath caught in her chest. Not from fear. From fury. The judge was just stepping into the room. Lawyers whispering. Reporters adjusting cameras. Phones starting to record. A courtroom full of people watching a woman get handcuffed before ever speaking a word. Her face was tight. Her mouth closed. Her eyes forward. I suggest you stop resisting before I add obstruction to your charges, he said, loud enough for the walls to hear. I'm not resisting, she replied. You're making a mistake. He leaned close. No, you made the mistake thinking someone like you belongs in a place like this. That sentence landed with a weight no badge could carry. And Aaliyah Monroe, kneeling in the middle of the hallway with steel around her wrists and her pride on the floor, knew this moment would change everything. Not just for her. But for him. For everyone watching. Because she hadn't come unprepared. Because she knew this wasn't just about one man's prejudice. This was about a system. And this moment, humiliating as it was, would become the turning point she needed to flip the power balance forever. But the people watching didn't know that yet. All they saw was a woman in cuffs and a man in control. For now. Because what happens when you try to humiliate the very woman who holds the truth about your deepest secrets? What happens when the person you tried to silence turns out to be the only voice that matters? What happens when Karma walks into the courtroom wearing heels, and her name is on the case file? They were about to find out. Aaliyah sat in the holding room adjacent to the courtroom, her wrists finally free but her dignity still pulsing with the burn of humiliation. The cuffs had left faint red marks along her skin, but the real bruise wasn't visible, it lived in the hollow space behind her sternum, where rage, disbelief, and control collided. A deputy, younger, uncertain, kept glancing at her from the doorway like he wasn't sure whether to apologize or disappear. He offered her a bottle of water, then hesitated before speaking. His voice was low, almost ashamed. I'm sorry for how that went down. We didn't know." She didn't respond. She didn't need sympathy. She needed silence. She needed a minute to recalibrate. Because what had just happened out there wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a revelation of how little progress had been made. Even with the badge. Even with the title. Even with the truth in her hands, it wasn't enough to protect her from being reduced to a stereotype in seconds. Outside, the courtroom buzzed. Word had already spread. Some reporters had caught part of the incident on camera. A few photos were surfacing online. People were whispering. The judge had paused the session under the pretense of clarification, but everyone in the building knew the real reason. The woman who was supposed to testify had been forcibly removed and humiliated in front of dozens of legal professionals, including the very people she had come to indict. And now she was back. And her testimony was still scheduled. But everything had shifted. Eyes were watching more closely. Sides were being taken. Lines were being drawn. Brent Halverson paced in the hallway with a smirk that refused to fade. Another officer nudged him with a grin. "Man, you really went in hard today." Halverson shrugged. "She was asking for it. You see the way she walked in here? Like she owned the place. Come on. What's the bureau doing sending someone like that? You can't blame a guy for calling out a fake." There was no guilt in his voice. No recognition of the damage he'd caused. To him, it had been just another moment of flexing muscle. But he hadn't seen the look in her eyes as he locked the cuffs. He didn't hear the words she muttered under her breath. He didn't understand the magnitude of what was coming. When the courtroom resumed, the judge's face was stony. He cleared his throat and addressed the room with rehearsed neutrality. "We will proceed with the testimony of Special Agent Aaliyah Monroe. I ask that all parties maintain decorum moving forward." But decorum had already been shattered. When Aaliyah stepped back into that room, the tension thickened. People leaned in. Phones shifted into silent recording modes. Even the stenographer's fingers seemed to hesitate above the keys. Aaliyah approached the stand without looking at Halverson. She didn't need to. His presence was a shadow behind her, but her spotlight was fixed. She placed her right hand on the Bible, left in the air, and took the oath with a voice steady and cold. The prosecutor approached. No need for a dramatic opening. The case had already caught fire. The prosecutor simply nodded and said, "Agent Monroe, please share your findings with the court." She opened her briefcase slowly, methodically, revealing a stack of organized documents, each tabbed and labeled. She placed a small black drive on the table and gestured to the screen where the court's projector was already warming up. Then, her voice cut the silence, clear and sharp. "Over the past 7 months, I have been conducting a covert investigation into coordinated misconduct within the St. Louis Police Department. The evidence I'm presenting includes audio recordings, falsified reports, and altered body cam footage that point to a pattern of racial profiling and procedural violations involving multiple officers." Whispers rippled through the crowd. She continued, unwavering. "I'd like to start with a specific incident. February 3, 11:46 p.m. traffic stop on Del Mar Boulevard. A 19-year-old black male was detained for failure to signal. No citation was issued. However, the dashcam audio reveals that Officer Brent Halverson instructed another officer to find something to justify the arrest. The courtroom froze. Brent shifted in his seat. His lawyer immediately objected, claiming the tape's authenticity hadn't been verified, but the judge overruled, the agent has credentials. Let's hear it. Aaliyah pressed play. The static gave way to car doors slamming, followed by Halverson's unmistakable voice. Doesn't matter. He's got priors. Find something. If we can't book him, we scare him. Gasps. Some audible. The young man's mother, seated 2 rows back, began to cry quietly. Aaliyah turned to the jury, her voice controlled. This isn't an isolated event. I have 12 additional recordings, each linked to stops involving African American citizens under 30. In each case, the arrests were either dropped or thrown out due to lack of evidence. The pattern is clear. The intent is undeniable. As she spoke, Brent's face tightened. He leaned over to whisper to his lawyer, sweat now forming at his temples. Gone was the smirk. Gone was the cocky demeanor. Aaliyah hadn't even looked at him, yet every word she delivered felt like a scalpel. The prosecution continued with their questions, guiding her through dates, names, locations, and tactics. Every response she gave was precise, her tone never wavering. She never broke. Not when she mentioned the intimidation tactics used on witnesses. Not when she described how certain reports had gone missing after being filed. Not even when she revealed that one of the officers on her list had tried to intimidate her directly 3 weeks prior. That part hit hard. Would you name the officer? The prosecutor asked. She didn't blink. Officer Brent Halverson. Silence. Total. Until the judge spoke, is this the same officer involved in the incident this morning? She turned her head slowly, met the judge's eyes, and nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Same officer. Which is why I respectfully request that the remainder of my testimony be protected under federal privilege. I believe there's a risk to my safety moving forward. The judge's mouth tightened. Request granted. A few people in the gallery clapped before being silenced. But something in the air had shifted. Brent was no longer a symbol of authority. He was a name in a file. A voice on a tape. A badge turned weapon. And Aaliyah Monroe was no longer the woman in handcuffs. She was the reckoning they never saw coming. After her testimony, she returned to the holding room. Alone again. She sat down slowly, her body still carrying the tension of what had just unfolded. A knock at the door. The prosecutor stepped in, closing it gently behind him. His voice was low. That was incredible. You sure you're ready for what comes next? She didn't answer right away. Then she turned her gaze to the small window where light filtered in across the metal table. He thought today was the end of my story, she said quietly. But he's about to learn it's only the beginning. And that's when the prosecutor handed her a sealed envelope. A court order. The kind that didn't just expose corruption, it erased careers. Lives. Reputations. She opened it slowly, eyes scanning the contents, then tucked it into her folder. Her breath was calm now. Her hand steady. Because what no one realized was that everything that had just happened was part of something much, much bigger. And what she was about to reveal next wouldn't just shake the courtroom. It would shake the entire department. And Brent Halverson? He wasn't ready. Not even close. The air in courtroom 4B felt different when Aaliyah returned the next morning. The wood of the benches looked darker, the air stiffer, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of what had been said the day before. Reporters had tripled. Microphones buzzed from outside. Word had spread fast. Headlines hinted at corruption, misconduct, a federal agent targeted by the very officer she was investigating. And now, what was supposed to be just another testimony had turned into the trial everyone in the city was watching. But there was something else now, a current of anticipation, quiet and sharp. Something was coming. Everyone could feel it. No one knew what it was. Halverson walked in 5 minutes late, noticeably disheveled. His collar was wrinkled, and he was chewing gum to hide the nerves in his jaw. For the first time, his confidence didn't lead the way. He sat next to his attorney, avoiding eye contact with the crowd, his posture defensive. Whispers followed him like shadows. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The room was already questioning him with every breath. And in that silence, Aaliyah stepped through the double doors once more. She wore the same black suit. Same briefcase. Same look in her eyes. But today, she didn't sit at the witness stand. Today, she stood near the clerk, waiting for the judge to address the room. Judge Reynolds entered, flipping through documents, then paused, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the docket. His tone shifted, carrying an edge of curiosity. "Before we begin with closing remarks," he said, "there's been a federal motion submitted this morning regarding sealed files. Agent Monroe, would you like to address the court directly?" Aaliyah nodded once and stepped forward. Her voice was calm, but every syllable was aimed like a blade. "Yes, Your Honor. I submitted an emergency motion this morning with the authorization of my supervisor at the Bureau. This motion includes the unsealing of new evidence relevant to this case and a formal request for immediate disciplinary action." The judge glanced at her, intrigued. "Against whom?" She didn't hesitate. "Against Officer Brent Halverson." A collective breath pulled through the courtroom. Halverson straightened. His lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously. Aaliyah reached into her briefcase and pulled out a second drive, this one marked with red tape. "Your Honor," she continued, "this drive contains not only the internal findings already presented, but an additional 26 minutes of audio gathered from a confidential source who worked directly under Officer Halverson. The recordings detail orders given by the officer to manipulate scene reports, pressure junior officers into planting evidence, and intimidate citizens into silence." The judge's brows lowered. "Are these recordings authenticated?" "Yes. Verified and time-stamped by forensic audio specialists under FBI supervision," she said, then turned slightly, eyes meeting Halverson's for the first time since she'd been handcuffed. He shifted uncomfortably. "This is a stunt," he barked, louder than he intended. "She's lying." She didn't blink. "Would you like to explain what you meant when you said, and I quote, 'I'm untouchable, I got the whole system in my pocket'? That's you on the tape, isn't it, officer?" His lawyer sprang up. "Your Honor, we object to the characterization." "Overruled," the judge snapped. "Let her finish." She kept her eyes on Halverson. "There's also footage from a parking lot, time-stamped last Thursday, in which Officer Halverson can be seen exchanging a file folder with another officer under investigation. The folder, we now know, contains altered affidavits meant to cover up the disappearance of key evidence." Murmurs rose like a wave. The judge banged his gavel once. "That footage exists." "It does. I have it here." The prosecutor approached, grabbing the drive. The clerk moved fast to connect it to the courtroom display. The footage began, grainy, but clear. 2 men. A dark parking lot. A handoff. Voices low but audible. "Make sure she doesn't get near that testimony," one voice said. "If she opens her mouth, we all burn." Everyone knew whose voice it was. Brent Halverson buried his face in his hands. His lawyer whispered again, this time with panic in his eyes. The screen paused on his face mid-conversation. The silence that followed was more damning than any speech could be. No one moved. Even the stenographer had stopped typing. Aaliyah's voice broke through. "Your Honor, we ask for immediate detainment of Officer Brent Halverson under obstruction of justice and conspiracy to interfere with a federal investigation." The judge didn't look up immediately. When he did, his face was grave. "Bailiff, Take the officer into custody. Gasps filled the room. Some people stood. A woman in the back clapped once before stopping herself. Halverson stood in disbelief. You can't be serious. You're believing her over me? This is a setup. This is political. The bailiff was already at his side, reaching for the cuffs. He tried to back away. Get off me, I didn't do anything. That's when Aaliyah stepped closer, just far enough for him to see her clearly but not enough to interfere with protocol. She spoke softly, just for him to hear. You didn't think I'd have the last word, did you? He glared at her, then laughed bitterly. You think this makes you better than me? That now they'll treat you different? You'll still just be, you should stop there, she cut in, her voice low and sharp. Before you embarrass yourself even more. He looked around the room. No one came to his defense. The officers in the back avoided his gaze. The people in the audience, some of them the same faces he'd once intimidated, watched in silence. He was alone now. Utterly alone. The cuffs clicked behind his back, the sound echoing across the courtroom like punctuation at the end of a sentence no one expected. He was walked out slowly, head low, face burning with a shame so thick it stuck to the walls. As the doors closed behind him, Aaliyah exhaled. The judge turned back to her. Agent Monroe, I believe I speak for everyone here when I say, thank you. She nodded once, expression unreadable, then walked away from the witness stand. The prosecutor followed her to the hallway, his tone lighter now. You were right, he said. The system needed to see it, with their own eyes. You knew exactly how to make them listen. She paused. They never listen until it affects someone in uniform. He nodded. You realize what this means? He's not the only one who's going down after this. You cracked the door. Now we kick it open. But Aaliyah didn't smile. She looked down the hallway toward the elevator, toward the cameras waiting outside. It's not over yet, she murmured. And it wasn't. Because now that Halverson had fallen, the rest would begin to crumble. And there was still one more file. One more name. One more revelation. But that would come next. And when it did, no one would be ready. The moment the courtroom doors closed behind Halverson, Aaliyah felt the weight of everything she'd carried for months settle into a new shape, less like a burden and more like resolve. The applause that followed his arrest was brief, hushed by the gravity of what had just happened. It wasn't a celebration. It was a reckoning. She walked out into the hallway, cameras waiting, questions flying, voices chasing her every step, but her eyes stayed forward. She didn't pause for the reporters, didn't flinch under the flashes. She had more to do. More to reveal. Because Brent Halverson was just the face of a deeper rot. And now that he had fallen, the structure he'd helped build was about to crumble. In the private conference room down the hall, Aaliyah stood with her supervisor, Agent Morales, a steady figure with gray at his temples and a quiet kind of authority. He closed the door behind them and placed his hands on the table, leaning forward with intensity. You sure you want to go forward with this part? He asked. She nodded. They need to see the whole thing. If we stop here, we just clip the head. The body stays alive. Morales studied her for a second, then gestured to the man sitting at the far end of the room. Younger, maybe 30. Nervous. Twitchy hands. Sweat on his upper lip. His name was Officer Daniel Ruiz, one of Halverson's former partners, and the confidential source whose recordings had cracked the case open. He looked at Aaliyah like someone looking at both salvation and fear at once. You don't have to do this, she said gently, sitting across from him. You've already helped more than you know. Ruiz shook his head. It's not enough. I let it happen for too long. I looked away too many times. I can't keep pretending I didn't know what kind of man he was. Her voice softened. Why now? He swallowed hard. Because I have a son. And last month, He asked me what I do at work. I told him I help people. And for the first time, I realized I didn't believe it. Silence settled over the room. Morales finally nodded. We'll protect you. But once this hits, you know it doesn't stop. You become the guy who flipped on the Brotherhood. I'm already that guy, Ruiz said, his voice steadier now. Might as well do something with it. Aaliyah opened her folder and slid a final transcript across the table, an unreleased recording. Ruiz nodded in recognition. That one's bad, he said. That's the meeting. The night before they went after Jordan Wells. She looked up. That's the kid who got 17 months for resisting arrest. He didn't resist, Ruiz muttered. He begged. I heard him. They took turns dragging him behind the building before the body cam kicked in. Her jaw tightened. And Halverson led it? Ruiz didn't speak. He just nodded once, slowly. She took a breath and stood. Then let's go finish it. An hour later, the courtroom filled again, not for a trial, but a special hearing. The city council members arrived. Senior figures from the bureau. Community leaders. Every pew was packed. The judge had reopened the session under a formal request for departmental exposure. It was rare. Unprecedented. But what was about to be revealed had pushed the system past precedent. The projection screen lit up again. This time, Aaliyah stood in the middle of the room, not at the witness stand, but on the floor, facing everyone. This, she began, her voice resonant, is the part no one expected. This is the part you were never meant to hear. She played the tape. Static first. Then a voice, Halverson's, cold and direct. I don't care if the kid screams. I want a report that says he resisted. You copy that? Another voice replied. Unclear. Shaky. Ruiz's. Then Halverson again. We're the story, Danny. We write it how we want. You let these people think they've got power, they'll start acting like they do. Gasps spread across the room. Some stood. The mother of Jordan Wells broke into quiet sobs. Ruiz lowered his head, unable to look at her. Aaliyah let the tape roll, more commands, more manipulation, more cruelty dressed as control. When it ended, there was no silence this time. Just low murmurs of disbelief, pain, and fury. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, we are officially requesting that all cases involving Officer Halverson and his listed associates over the past 5 years be re-examined under federal supervision. And that Officer Daniel Ruiz be granted full whistleblower protection. The judge didn't hesitate. Granted. Someone clapped. Then another. And soon, the room erupted, not in applause, but in a release of something that had been building for too long. Rage. Relief. Gratitude. It wasn't joy. It was something heavier. But it was real. Afterward, in the empty hallway outside the courtroom, Ruiz approached Aaliyah. His voice was raw. She's here, he said quietly. The mother. I know, she replied. He looked down. I want to talk to her. I owe her that. Aaliyah nodded slowly. It won't be easy. I'm not asking for easy. I'm asking for right. He walked past her toward the exit, heart pounding. Aaliyah watched him go, then turned the other way, heading for the back stairs. She didn't need the cameras. The interviews. She had done what she came to do. But her thoughts weren't finished. Because for all the exposure, all the consequences, one truth remained. No badge had protected her. It was her voice, her courage, her pain turned into action that brought the truth forward. And there were more like her out there. More who were tired. More who were rising. Her phone buzzed. A message from Morales. We're getting calls from D.C. You just started something bigger than this city. She looked at the message for a long time before sliding the phone back into her pocket. Then she exhaled and pushed the door open, walking back into the world that had doubted her, that had tried to break her. But not today. Today, she broke it. The dust hadn't settled yet, but the consequences had already begun to take shape. Just 48 hours after the tapes were played in court and Brent Halverson was led away in handcuffs, the local police department had called for an emergency press conference. Not to condemn him. Not to apologize. But to clarify the department's stance, a carefully worded excuse dressed up as damage control. Cameras surrounded the precinct steps, reporters flooding the sidewalk, but the crowd that had gathered was made of more than just press. Community members stood shoulder to shoulder with signs in their hands, fury in their eyes, and silence in their mouths. They weren't shouting. They weren't rioting. They were waiting. Waiting to hear if the system would protect itself again, or if, for once, it would choose accountability. Aaliyah watched from across the street, leaning against the cold metal of a street lamp, her ID badge tucked away. She didn't need the spotlight. She wasn't looking for glory. What she was watching for wasn't in the speech, it was in the body language, in the eyes of officials forced to stand behind a podium and pretend they hadn't known. She studied their posture, their deflections, the way they used phrases like unfortunate oversight and pending internal review. It was infuriating, but not surprising. And yet, this time, their performance wasn't landing. Not the way it used to. The crowd didn't believe them. The silence on the street was louder than any protest. And she could feel it, that shift, that collective awakening that whispered, "We're not afraid of you anymore." That same day, subpoenas were issued to 3 other officers named in the recordings. 2 had already lawyered up. 1 resigned quietly, trying to disappear before the Bureau could officially investigate. But it was too late. Aaliyah had already compiled a full report, submitted not just to the Justice Department, but to the Civil Rights Division. And the case had sparked something bigger than she expected, emails from other agents, from other cities, from other people of color in law enforcement who had stayed quiet for years but now wanted to speak. She had unintentionally become a symbol. Not because she wanted to be, but because she had walked through the fire and made it out still standing. The Bureau offered her a temporary leave. Said it was protocol, to de-escalate tensions. She declined. There was still too much to do. Morales backed her, quietly handling the political side while she focused on the real work. But that didn't mean she was untouched by the aftermath. Social media exploded. Her name trended. Anonymous threats began to show up in her inbox. News channels called her a hero. Conservative blogs called her a liar. The world had seen her win, but few understood what that win had cost. Every time she opened her laptop, her face stared back at her from a dozen articles, each with a headline more dramatic than the last. Some called it bravery. Others called it betrayal. But no one called it justice. Not yet. One evening, while reviewing files in a dimly lit conference room, she got a call. Unknown number. Normally, she wouldn't have picked up. But something about the silence in the room made her answer. A breath, then a voice. "You don't know me," the woman said, "but my son was one of the kids Officer Halverson arrested last year. He was 17. Spent a night in jail for walking home with a hoodie on. Nothing happened to him. Not physically. But after that, he stopped going outside. He stopped talking. He was afraid of the police, of anyone in uniform. You gave him his voice back." Aaliyah didn't speak. The words hit deeper than any medal or statement ever could. When the woman finished, she simply said, "Thank you. For not giving up." Then the call ended. That was the moment Aaliyah allowed herself to feel it. Not victory. Not pride. But something heavier, relief and grief mixed together. She stared at the table in front of her, stacks of case files half open, and thought about how many names would never be called. How many kids had been silenced, how many parents still carried unanswered questions. She had uncovered one part of a much larger truth, but the rest still lived in sealed boxes and redacted reports. And somewhere in that realization, the question formed, how much change is actually possible when the system is built to protect itself first? She started sleeping less, eating less, haunted not by what she had seen, but by what she now knew she couldn't unsee. A colleague tried to joke one day, said, "You shook the hive, Monroe. Now the bees are flying." But Aaliyah wasn't afraid of bees. She was afraid that once the buzz died down, everything would go back to the way it was. She saw it happen before. Flash of outrage. Moment of action. Then silence. It was a cycle she knew too well. But this time had to be different. Ruiz reached out days later. He was in hiding, relocated by bureau protocol. He wanted to talk. Over a secure line, he told her he'd received threats too. His former partner had called his mother. His tires had been slashed. But even through the fear, his voice held something else, clarity. "I used to think being a cop was about loyalty," he said. "Now I think it's about courage. And you showed me what that actually looks like." She exhaled slowly. "You did the hard part. You spoke up." He laughed lightly. "No. You did the hard part. You stayed." She didn't respond. Because part of her wanted to leave. Part of her wanted to disappear, to go somewhere people didn't know her face, didn't know her story, didn't call her a hero or a target. But there was something stronger pulling at her, the stories left unfinished, the victims who hadn't found their voice yet, the system still rotting behind closed doors. She couldn't leave. Not yet. Later that week, she was asked to attend a private review board hearing. It wasn't mandatory, but it was recommended. She walked into the federal building wearing the same suit she wore the day Halverson was arrested. Same briefcase. But this time, her steps felt heavier. Not unsure, just more aware of the weight she carried now. The board sat across from her, 5 people in tailored suits, neutral expressions, carefully calibrated tones. They asked about procedure. About evidence handling. About her decision to publicly release the footage before the Bureau had completed internal review. It was all expected. But then came the question she hadn't prepared for. Do you believe your actions have damaged the relationship between federal law enforcement and local departments? She blinked slowly, the question sitting heavy in the air. Then she leaned forward, her voice even. "I believe my actions exposed damage that was already there. We didn't break trust. We revealed its absence." One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Another cleared their throat. No one responded. She had said what needed to be said. They could write their reports however they wanted. But the truth was out now. And it wasn't going back in. When the hearing ended, she walked out into the afternoon light, the sky washed in gold, the city buzzing below her feet. She didn't know what would happen next. Whether she'd be reassigned, reprimanded, or rewarded. But she knew one thing, she had done the right thing. And whatever came after, she was ready for it. Because real justice didn't come with medals. It came with scars. With sleepless nights. With people calling you too angry, too loud, too much. But it also came with mothers calling to say thank you. And sometimes, that was enough. Almost. The city began to change, slowly, not in grand announcements or sweeping reforms, but in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. Patrol cars now moved slower through certain neighborhoods, the officers inside no longer wearing the armor of unchecked power. Town hall meetings were more crowded than ever, with citizens no longer whispering their frustrations but standing to speak with voices that trembled at first, then grew steadier with every word. The local news shifted its tone, less polished now, more raw, more willing to call out what had been obvious to so many for so long. But change never comes clean. It comes dragging weight, resistance, backlash. And Aaliyah felt that weight every morning she walked into the field office, the way some heads turned away, how certain conversations stopped when she entered the room. There were people in the bureau who respected her more now, but there were also people who feared her. Not because she was violent, not because she was vindictive, but because she had proved she wouldn't protect the wrong people, and in this system, that made her dangerous. One morning, Morales pulled her into a private room without warning. His face looked tired, drawn, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. He shut the door behind them and leaned against it like he needed to physically hold back the rest of the world. "They're talking about transferring you," he said, voice low but direct. "High-level people. People you and I don't usually get to look in the eye." Aaliyah didn't flinch. "What's the official reason?" "Public attention. Safety. All the usual excuses." He sighed, then added, "But off the record. They're scared of you." She crossed her arms, her tone flat. "Scared of accountability." He nodded. "And scared you're not done." There was a silence between them, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with years of unspoken understanding between two people who had both seen too much and stayed too long in a system that rewarded silence more than truth. Aaliyah took a breath, her mind already calculating the next steps. "I'm not transferring," she said. "Not unless they force me. And if they do, I want it in writing." Morales smiled, tired but proud. "That's what I told them you'd say." He walked toward the window, pulling the blinds slightly to look outside at the street below, then spoke again without turning around. "I've got something else. Quiet case. Off the radar. Name just came up this morning. Anonymous drop. Might connect to what we uncovered." Aaliyah walked over, standing beside him. "What kind of case?" He handed her a manila envelope, plain, no markings. Inside were surveillance photos, blurry, but one detail stood out: one of the men in the image was wearing a badge. Not local. Not state. Federal. She looked at Morales. "This from internal?" He shook his head. "Came from someone outside the bureau. They want it cleaned up quietly. But I think it's meant for you." Her pulse quickened slightly. She studied the images again, her mind tracing the outline of something bigger, something that stretched beyond St. Louis. If Halverson was part of a pattern, this could be the thread that unraveled more than just a precinct. She didn't say anything at first. Then she looked at Morales and nodded once. "Let's pull the string." That night, she went home to a voicemail from her mother. Her voice was warm, but filled with the caution of someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for bad news. She asked how Aaliyah was holding up, if she was eating, if she had thought about coming home for a while just to breathe. Then, near the end of the message, her voice broke slightly, and she said, "You always were stronger than I knew how to prepare you for. I'm proud of you, baby. Just, be safe." Aaliyah sat on her couch for a long time after that, the phone still in her hand. She remembered being 12, walking home from school, wearing her father's old army jacket, oversized and heavy. She had been stopped by an officer who claimed she looked like someone who had just robbed a store. He pushed her against a wall, called her a liar, didn't believe her until a teacher came out and screamed. That memory used to haunt her, but now it lived differently inside her, no longer a wound, but a warning. The system had always been like this. The only thing that had changed was that now she had a platform to fight it. And she wasn't going to waste it. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, documents, meetings. She met with a young lawyer from the Civil Rights Division, a sharp woman named Natalie who had fire in her eyes and anger in her voice. They connected immediately, both of them women who had been underestimated, both of them ready to burn through red tape and protocol to get to the truth. Natalie brought more files. Old cases. Discarded complaints. Patterns. Aaliyah read through them with growing certainty that what they had uncovered in St. Louis was not unique. It was systemic. Woven into policies. Disguised as procedure. And worse, protected by silence. One night, after a 14-hour shift, Natalie and Aaliyah sat in the dim light of the office break room, exhausted and hollow. Natalie spoke first. "You ever think about walking away from it?" Aaliyah leaned back, eyes on the ceiling. "Every day." Natalie hesitated, then added, "Why don't you?" There was a pause, then Aaliyah's voice came, soft but firm. "Because if I do, then I'm one more empty seat at the table. And there are too many of those already." The next morning, something unexpected happened. One of the officers who had remained silent during Halverson's time came forward. Not with a confession. With a question. He asked to speak with Aaliyah privately. She met him in the back hallway of the precinct, where the lights flickered and the paint peeled from the walls. He was older, maybe 50, with tired eyes and hands that couldn't stay still. "I didn't know how bad it was," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't ask either. That makes me part of it, right?" Aaliyah didn't let him off easy. "Yes." He swallowed hard. "What do I do now?" She looked at him for a long time, reading the fear in his posture, the guilt clinging to his clothes like smoke. "You speak up. And you keep speaking, even when they stop listening." He nodded slowly, as if the weight of decades was finally crashing down on him. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." In the weeks that followed, more people started talking. Officers. Lawyers. Community members. Victims. The Bureau began to shift, not drastically, not overnight, but undeniably. Policies were reviewed. Cases reopened. A task force formed. And at the center of it all was Aaliyah. Not giving speeches. Not claiming credit. Just working. Quiet. Relentless. Unshakable. But the deeper she went, the more she realized something else. The problem wasn't just about bad people doing bad things. It was about good people doing nothing. About systems built to protect their own, no matter the cost. And every file she opened was another name, another story, another wound. There were no simple answers. No clean victories. Just grit. And hope. And persistence. One evening, as she left the office, she saw a teenager waiting outside the building. He was tall, lanky, maybe 16. He looked nervous. She approached slowly, cautious. "You waiting for someone?" she asked. He nodded. "You." She paused, unsure. "Do I know you?" "No," he said, voice quiet. "But I saw the video. The one with the cop and the badge. You said stuff nobody else says. My brother got arrested last year. Said the same cop roughed him up. Nobody believed him. I just wanted to say thank you." She stood there, heart twisting, unsure what to say. Then she offered him a small smile. "You don't need to thank me. Just keep speaking up. Keep showing up." He nodded, then walked away. She watched him disappear into the evening, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something shift inside her. Not peace. Not quite. But something close. The days began to stretch into each other like blurred brush strokes on a canvas too heavy with history. Aaliyah didn't count them anymore. She moved from one task to the next with a focus that bordered on mechanical, but beneath it, something more volatile brewed, a deep, restless energy fueled not by vengeance, but by necessity. She couldn't stop. Not now. Not when names were still buried in outdated files. Not when people were still calling her office with trembling voices asking if their stories would finally matter. Not when the same questions kept echoing across desks and precinct walls: how did we not know? Why didn't anyone stop it? But she knew the answer. They did know. And they chose silence. Because silence cost less than truth. Until now. She had become a symbol, something she never asked for. People sent her letters, emails, even flowers. Some thanked her. Others begged for help. A few hated her openly, accused her of betrayal, of dividing the brotherhood. That word made her stomach twist every time she heard it. Brotherhood, as if wearing the same badge absolved them of humanity, as if it was a shield not just from bullets but from accountability. And yet, amidst all the noise, one voice from her past cut through more than the rest. It came in the form of a handwritten letter, addressed in neat cursive with no return address. When she opened it, the paper smelled faintly of dust and cologne, and the words were few but heavy. I watched what you did. I remember you from Birmingham. You were that little girl with the fire in her eyes. You made it. I didn't. But I'm glad one of us did. LJ. Aaliyah froze when she read it. LJ. Those initials unlocked a door in her memory she hadn't walked through in years. LJ was 17 when she was 12. He lived 2 houses down, always riding his bike too fast, always daring the world to catch him. He used to sneak her bubble gum and tell her stories about running away to California. But one day, he just disappeared. No one ever told her why. Some neighbors whispered about a drug charge. Others claimed he'd been framed. All she knew was that one day he was there, and the next he wasn't. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her drawer, next to the badge she never wore unless necessary. Not because she wasn't proud, but because she'd learned that pride didn't keep people safe. Truth did. Work did. A week later, she was called into a meeting at the Bureau's regional headquarters. The kind of meeting that doesn't get scheduled on email, the kind that begins with someone knocking on your door and ends with 4 agents in suits guiding you into a room where no one smiles. She sat across from 2 unfamiliar faces, one from Internal Affairs, the other from Washington. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't offer coffee. They began with a question. Are you currently in possession of any case materials outside Bureau jurisdiction? Aaliyah didn't blink. No, they exchanged a look. One leaned forward. We have reason to believe you've been contacted by civilian informants who are passing you sealed data. She kept her voice calm. If I'm contacted, I refer it to the proper channels. They pushed. Have you or have you not been reviewing off-record communications from other departments? Her jaw tightened. What's this really about? Silence. Then one of them spoke, slower this time. This isn't an interrogation, Agent Monroe. But it is a warning. What you've done has drawn national attention. Some of it good. Some of it, volatile. There are people who want you to continue. And others who don't. Aaliyah leaned back, letting the weight of that land. Then she asked, and which one are you? They didn't answer. Instead, they stood, offering her a folder as they did. Inside were surveillance reports. Photos of people she'd spoken to. Copies of emails. A level of monitoring she hadn't expected but wasn't surprised by. Be careful, one of them said before leaving. Sometimes being right doesn't protect you. She sat there long after they were gone, flipping through the pages. Her hands didn't shake. But her heart did something else, it slowed, not from fear, but from understanding. She had become too visible. Too loud. And now, the system that once ignored her was watching her very closely. The message was clear. They couldn't discredit her work, so they would try to isolate her. Make her doubt. Make her hesitate. But they had misunderstood one thing. Aaliyah hadn't survived Birmingham, Quantico, and Halverson to stop because of shadow threats in clean suits. Later that night, she met with Natalie at the edge of a park downtown, away from cameras and signals, the old-fashioned kind of meeting where trust had to be stronger than fear. They sat on a cold bench, steam rising from their coffee cups, and Aaliyah handed her the folder. "They're tracking me," she said. Natalie flipped through it, her eyes narrowing. "We expected this. But it's more than surveillance," Aaliyah added. "They're looking for a crack. A way to discredit me before I find the next name." Natalie looked up. "Then we find it first." Aaliyah smiled, faint and tired. "You still in?" Natalie didn't hesitate. "I never left." That night, they began cross-referencing files again, focusing on departments with high complaint rates, unresolved internal investigations, and sudden resignations. Patterns began to emerge. Certain phrases repeated in reports. Certain signatures. It was bigger than Halverson. Bigger than St. Louis. It was woven into a culture that had thrived on silence for decades. Then they found it. A case from 5 years ago. A young officer who had attempted to report misconduct and was found dead 2 months later, official cause, suicide. But the file had inconsistencies. Statements from colleagues that didn't match timelines. A final report that was never signed. And in the last page of his notes, a name was scrawled in the corner, Monroe. Aaliyah stared at it for a long time, the breath catching in her chest. She didn't know him. Had never worked with him. But somehow, he had found her name. Maybe he was reaching out. Maybe he thought she could help. And maybe they had silenced him before she even knew. She looked at Natalie, her voice quiet but firm. "We reopen this case." Natalie nodded. "We'll need clearance. Then we find someone who still believes in the oath." In that moment, Aaliyah understood something deeper. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about memory. About the people whose stories had been erased. About making sure that the next officer who tried to do the right thing wouldn't die without someone noticing. And it was about her too. Because if they could erase one person, they could erase her. And she wasn't going to let that happen. She stood from the bench, the wind biting at her coat, and stared out at the city. She was tired. But she wasn't done. Not yet. The investigation into the 5-year-old case triggered something unexpected. What began as a single reopened file spread like wildfire across departments, linking old records, buried complaints, and overlooked resignations. Aaliyah and Natalie found themselves at the center of a storm, not just professionally but publicly. More whistleblowers emerged, some anonymous, some bold enough to attach their names. Patterns turned into blueprints, and the silence that once protected the powerful began to crack under the pressure of undeniable evidence. The young officer's death, once written off as suicide, was now officially being reinvestigated as a possible homicide connected to internal corruption. And the thread that tied it all together, the one that had surfaced with a name scrawled in a corner, now became the centerpiece of a larger probe that would eventually be known across the country as the Monroe Inquiry. A special federal task force was assembled, and Aaliyah was invited to lead it. At first, she hesitated. The offer came with resources, freedom, but also greater exposure and risk. Yet after a quiet night alone, staring at the same photo of the young officer's note, she made her decision. She accepted, not for the politics, not for the recognition, but because she knew what it meant. It meant her voice could now protect others. That no one else would have to scream into a void, praying someone would listen. Natalie became the legal backbone of the operation. Her sharp mind and refusal to back down in the face of bureaucratic intimidation earned her not only respect but fear from those who once dismissed her as just another civil rights lawyer. Her presence in courtrooms was now met with quiet anticipation. People knew that if Natalie showed up, something was about to be held accountable. Ruiz, once hidden under protective custody, stepped forward publicly. It took time, but when he testified before a national oversight committee about his experiences, his voice trembled only for the first few minutes. Then it found strength. His story inspired policy discussions around whistleblower protections nationwide. He later joined an independent advisory board that worked to counsel law enforcement officers struggling with the moral dissonance of their work. His silence had once fueled the problem, but his courage helped light a new path. As for Brent Halverson, the verdict came swiftly and without mercy. With overwhelming evidence stacked against him, the jury had little debate. He was found guilty of obstruction, abuse of power, tampering with evidence, and multiple civil rights violations. His sentencing made headlines, not just because of the years he received, but because of what he said before being led out of the courtroom. No denial. No apology. Just a bitter, broken man whispering, "I never thought it would be her." His fall wasn't just legal. It was symbolic. A warning to others who still thought their power placed them above consequences. And then there was Aaliyah. She became more than a name on a badge. She became a catalyst. Invitations came in from across the country to speak at universities, departments, and conferences. But she accepted only a few, choosing instead to remain grounded in the work itself. She led quietly, not from podiums, but from behind desks piled high with truth. But the recognition came nonetheless. In time, she was offered a senior position at the Bureau, a role that would allow her to restructure internal accountability programs nationwide. She took it, not for the title, but because it gave her access to change things from within. Policies were rewritten. Training manuals revised. A new generation of recruits now read her name in the first chapter of the Ethics Handbook. Not as a savior. Not as a cautionary tale. But as a precedent. One spring afternoon, after nearly a year of non-stop work, she finally returned home to Birmingham. The house where her mother still lived smelled the same, like lemon oil and books. She walked into her old room, untouched, preserved like a time capsule. On the desk, now dusted clean, sat the same 2 photos of her father that had always been there. She sat down and stared at them for a long while, the silence wrapping around her like a blanket. Then her mother entered, placed a hand on her shoulder, and said softly, "He'd be proud of you, you know." Aaliyah didn't speak. She just reached up, touched her mother's hand, and let herself breathe for the first time in what felt like forever. The victory wasn't just that the bad men had fallen. It was that the ones who were told to stay quiet had found their voice. That the girl who once had her face shoved into a courtroom bench had stood up, unbroken, and changed the room she was never supposed to belong in. It was that justice didn't come wrapped in applause or trophies, but in the simple, radical act of doing what's right, again and again, even when no one is watching. And now, it's your turn. You heard the story. You walked through it with Aaliyah, with Natalie, with Ruiz. You saw what it means to confront a system that prefers silence. But what would you do if it was you? Would you speak up when it's inconvenient? Would you listen when someone else finally finds the courage to break their silence? Would you risk comfort for truth? Injustice doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes, it hides in protocol, in paperwork, in polite conversation. But if stories like this one teach us anything, it's that justice begins the moment someone decides enough is enough. So tell me, after hearing all of this, what would you have done? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share what this story meant to you. Let your voice be heard, because that's how we break the silence. And if this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think twice, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more powerful narratives that turn pain into purpose and truth into transformation. We'll be right here, waiting to share the next one with you.